Now we are now called Select Genetics. It's the combination of the Valley of the Moon operations and the AgForte Wilmar Poultry group of companies. So if you're real anal, that is the new company for us. What I want to talk about is a little bit of food security, and really you're going to see my inner schizophrenic come out a little bit. We're going to jump around with a few things, using the High Path event as a little bit of a model, and then hopefully at the end I'll tie it all back together with a few main takeaway points so I can keep my Baptist and preacher background alive and well. The first thing is food security. It's really hard to think about that when you're sitting in the United States, I think. A lot of people don't really have a concept of food insecurity. A lot of times you see the infographic in the upper left there with all these kind of different numbers and things thrown out about how much waste we have in the U.S. And when you look around, if you travel at all, you see that. And you see a lot of the waste. And most people, when they think food insecurity and to the point where it's a really big problem, they automatically think to the pictures that you see at the bottom where we have people and food lines, but it's really not American. We don't associate with that America. And now recently, a lot of the media and the professional chefs that have all the chef TVs, a lot of them really kind of united into that upper right picture where we're starting to identify some of these lower income group families that are really struggling to get food. And we kind of overlook that and forget about that in the U.S. So you kind of have these extremes of food insecurity and food security. And that's, my background and my personal feeling, and many of the people that I work with, whether they're family farmers or people just employed for us on our company farms, the reason people get up in the morning, the reason people go to that alarm call at 2 o'clock in the morning, the reason that they stick more money into a cow than it's worth is because they feel it's the right thing to do for the animal, but also they feel a burden or a need to provide for people, and they take that job seriously. So when they see suffering, whether it's here in the U.S. or around the world, they want to do something about it. And so what we have to do is really work at that. The first thing that I want to hit one slide right off the top is communication. What we're going to talk about really is we're going to be a recap and some examples surrounding the secure poultry supply plan and how that relates to keeping food secure even in the event of a disease outbreak. But the one thing that really doesn't go into a lot of depth, mainly because I'm a veterinarian with a PhD, which is supposed to mean something or stand for something, but really it means I'm a scientist and I have no imagination. And so I have to have real logic and real things to measure, and I don't do very well with this idea of social networking, how people work, emotions, that type of thing. I really struggle with that kind of stuff. And so the secure turkey supply plans are really based out of and from people that are a lot like me. Or logic, science, there's a study, there's some papers, there's something like that, versus, hey, what's the public pressure, how they're going to take it, messaging, what does this word or that word mean? And it means a lot in an outbreak. After going through this, communication and using the right words at the right time or not saying anything at all, those types of things are incredibly important. The communication is incredibly important with what we do and say to people within our company so that they have the right messages, that they can go home to their wives or work with people in the company so they know what they're supposed to do. That type of communication with regulatory personnel, how we interface that with the public and who does that and what they say and what they don't say or how they say it. Communication with our key customers. Many of us are very integrated groups, protein-producing groups, and we have big-name clients like the Walmarts and the Costcos and the different McDonald's and the fast food restaurant and retail restaurant world, and they have big questions. They're big buyers, and if they have some public pressure that whatever disease outbreak that you're undergoing has an interest, we need to be able to communicate the science with that, and then help them in crafting that message where the science and social sciences kind of mesh. Then we have the states and even country level communication that came up, and I'll show you examples of some of the state issues that we ran into of how we communicate. We don't have that ironed out, but it's a lot better now that we've, in a sense, done not a dry run, but a real run. And then really trying to work that, because in the middle of an outbreak, we'll show you some pictures of what that means for people like me when you're in the middle of that outbreak where you have regulatory pressure, you got public pressure, you got economic pressure, and trying to balance all that and communicate them all real well. And the part that we have to take home is we all have very important roles in the communication component, whether you're academia, regulatory, or the industry, that we can all play really complementary parts. And so if we're all on a team, and hopefully that's what you see come through as a theme, I might pick on certain sectors, including ours, from time to time, but really we're all on the same team, and if we don't have a very good, tight relationship where we can kind of, I always use the term get naked, the science safety shower. When I have acid on me, I have to be comfortable enough to get naked in front of my fellow students or professors and get that washed off because it's burning my body. And that's kind of where you are when you're in a disease outbreak. You have to understand what you're going to have to do. It may not be what you normally would do on any other given day. So we're going to use this as a model. I didn't know how many people, I didn't know their background, so I wanted to start pretty basic. But we're going to use the high path outbreak since I got to be the guy that started it off unwillingly. But we're going to use this as a model and talk about some things that popped up and how that relates and hopefully tie it all together. But if you're familiar with this, about 50 million birds ended up being euthanized or dying from the disease. About 7 million of those or so were turkeys, and we were kind of the epicenter for that. We were a turkey breeding company, and we lost all of our company-owned breeding stock in Minnesota. And so we felt the brunt of it and the surrounding areas. So much of the time, this is really a combination of what we felt like, and Dr. Hickam, I think, can vouch for that as well. When you go through something like this, you come out a lot stronger. You might have been shooting and stabbing and slicing right next to each other, but when you come out of there, you're a pretty tight group with the regulatory people, the other companies. It was very much, we have a lot of war analogies that we all used during this time period. But really, you came out like this picture of the Band of Brothers from the TV show or the HBO series, but you came out of there where you're a tight-knit group now. There's really not much that bothers the group and what you can and can't share coming out of that. And I think that's going to be a good thing going forward. So looking, if we say, okay, that's great, that was in the past. Well, we have things cooking now as far as the poultry world's concerned. This is focused in a little bit on Europe, and this is a current H5N8. So this is just H5N8. And in wild and domestic birds, so the wild would be the triangles, the domestic would be the circles. And there's a pretty big outbreak going on. And the unique thing about this is that it's in so many different species of wild birds. I think 80-ish, over 80 now, different species of wild birds as this is in. You can see what it's doing to Europe. If you remember from the slide before there, we had about 211 cases in the last outbreak. France alone has doubled that. And so that'll help you give the scope as far as the number of premises, number of cases. So this is a big deal. This is actually causing wild bird die-offs. This is a high-path strain. But it's not really doing anything in humans, which is a good thing. But the number of wild bird species that it's in is a little bit alarming. So if we zoom out and then I add in all high-path cases, so regardless whether they're an H5 or an H7, you see what the rest of the world looks like. And if you look in this area, what you see here as a veterinarian, what I see there is a very large naive population, is what I see. And so when whatever is over here circling around gets in here, it may explode. It may do nothing. I don't know. So I think we have to be cognizant that we have risk. So what we're talking about today and the different things that we've been working on and adjusting to, they're very real for us in the poultry industry because we're in a new age with this goose Guangdong lineage of high-path influenza that is around the world in various parts, that it's very stable and it's been sticking around, and we have to be very aware of it. Because this is what it does. These are some pictures from the high path, and there's nothing more sinking to people than to walk into these barns and as soon as you open the door to hear the silence. If you're not familiar with turkey production, they're a very social bird. They will talk to you and they will follow you all around. Versus chickens, they kind of scatter and get away from you. Turkeys will actually follow you, and we were joking about it earlier. I was in some market age toms about 4 days ahead, and I got about halfway down the barn, I'm about naked. They just love to get up against you and beat on you and pick on you and have a ball with you. So turkeys, to be able to silence, it's absolutely unforgettable, and what you see when you open a door. And so this plays into a lot of what we're talking about, because there's this emotional factor. The people that are involved have this going on, and so when you flash up things like this going on to our producers that have already been through this, they get very disturbed, some of them, and get very paranoid for some of them. So how do we attack these diseases without killing the industry that we're trying to save? That's some of the challenge. And how do we do very good disease control, limit exposure, limit movement, all the things that you need to do for disease, but then also not do it so that you strangulate the industry so badly that it actually can't, it's worse than the disease. And that was the challenge. If you take away nothing from today, please take away this. The people that are going to control an outbreak are the people that touch the birds. A state regulatory person or a federal regulatory person is going to observe the test results, going to make quarantines, make biosecurity recommendations, whatever. But ultimately, it's that person touching the bird or going in and out of a barn that's actually going to have to abide by that. So even as veterinarians for a company, I'm not going to control it. It's the people that are actually going into that barn and interacting with the birds that are going to be responsible for the control of this. We have to give them tools, we have to give them education, provide some frameworks, but really the industry, the people, are going to be the ones that actually truly control or continue an outbreak. The other thing is the industry can't actually afford it. If you're familiar with commodity agriculture, it's very large money, that's undeniable, but that comes from scale mostly. It's very low margin business. We often get kidded by our bankers for our company routinely about how high risk and low margin that we'd have to be insane to go into this business. And so that's just part of commodity agriculture. And so then the continuity of business of how do we work through a disease outbreak without messing up the entire industry that we're trying to save becomes really important. So we have these competing things that we're trying to do. I drew it as circles for overlapping, but this control of disease, we have a lot of people focused on that, whether it be veterinarians or the regulatory folks. We have the continuity of business or the industry folks saying, hey, I got to get these birds here, I got to get this meat there, I've got to get eggs, whatever the case might be. But I have to keep going. We're a 24-hour-a-day, 7-day-a-week business. So how do I do that? And then we have this idea of international trade, international relations, trade relations, some of our big customers, of how are we doing this, how are we controlling it, we can't afford to have this PR, or we're going to cancel your contract if you're one of the ones that it's positive, those types of competing interests. And so what do we do? What's our plan for this area of how do we balance all of that appropriately? And so for us in the poultry industry, we have the Secure Poultry Supply Plan. Other industries have some of their others. And so I'm going to dive into a little bit of what that means. So this is a little bit of a graphic, if you will, of what we hope will happen. And that's where for the poultry supply plans, it's all risk assessment based, and we'll kind of walk through that in a second. But we'll have a risk assessment of whatever step or procedure or movement that we would want to do. We'd hopefully have some science to back that up, so that's a risk assessment. We've done a little bit of science work, gave it to some modelers, and it says, hey, it's high risk, medium risk, low risk, no risk. We have some of these voluntary preparedness components, meaning the industry and the regulatory say, hey, these things are kind of what we would expect to be able to do this, and here's your permitting guidance that would work. And then hopefully, never, but when this happens, we have an outbreak, all of that's already in place ahead of it. So we've planned ahead. So then we just add in the components of the traceability, add in some test results that we would need that fall into that voluntary preparedness part, and do some C&D precautions, and then issue some permits. And and that would be largely the role of the incident command. So secure whatever supply plan, whether that's poultry, broiler, turkey, pork, dairy, egg, whatever supply plan, really they're based off of these core risk assessments. So a science-based assessment looking at published literature. Dr. Sellers was in here talking about the feed, and hey, we haven't looked at this because it's not published. Well, we saw that as far as the secure turkey supply plan or secure poultry supply plans. Said, well, we can't just limit it to studies because nobody does the study on, moving a pheasant from South Dakota to Nebraska for hunting. Nobody's going to invest all the money that it takes to do a risk assessment on that specific movement. So we need to have some way of incorporating more than just published literature. So published literature, modeling, and then some of these expert opinions. So folks like me or Dr. Hector, Dr. Gingrich or others get on a lot of phone calls for some of these and put in input and say, hey, I think this is this way. And somebody else will say, no, you're crazy. That's not ever going to work. That's not okay. And so we go back and forth and try to hammer something out that fits a little bit of science, and as well as a lot of companies may have data that actually doesn't get published for sensitivity issues, just like what Richard Sellers was up here talking about. Sometimes people don't want some things out there. And so we have a way to share that privately that can get rolled into that. So out of that, we categorize a lot of these procedures or risk or movements based on risk. So high risk, medium, low or negligible. Then we provide some input on mitigation steps. Again, using science as much as we can, but if we don't have the science, we either try to get it done or go with what we know from a group of people. Then we sign the framework for moving these. That includes the surveillance, so the testing, and how often, and what tests, and how many tests per tube, that type of thing. Some biosecurity, what needs to go, what the industry needs to be carrying out, how do they need to behave, how do they need to get in and out of a barn. Some mitigation steps, so if I am going to take something off a premise, am I going to wash just the wheels or the whole thing or not at all? Am I going to fog? Those types of things. And then there's a permit from the state folks or the federal folks on how do I get that off so they can actually track this movement. The idea is that this is a living document. We wanted to understand that, hey, we might be smart today, but that doesn't mean we're smart next year when we learn more or the virus changes some way that's significant. So we don't want it to be locked down. We want it to be a living document. And the draft terminology was on there, which created some problems when we say draft. But you'll be seeing that go away, and we'll be using some different terminology. But the idea was that it was a living document. That's why it was a draft. Not that it wasn't any good. It was just that it was meant to be flexible. So a couple things I want to highlight that we learned on this was one thing that I went around talking about was we were slow to react. This is a graph. If you look at the y-axis here, this is the days from sample to depopulation it took. These are the number of sites in Minnesota, so 1 through 109. This first site, for example, took 6 days to depopulate from the time we sampled it to the time that they were depopulated. So we see that bounce around between 5 and 10 days, and this is right in the area where I started to get a little unfriendly because we were starting to see what I called airborne, that was part of the communication thing I learned, that some words are used inappropriately. It's not airborne in the terms that the international community says airborne, but we started seeing this drive around on the dust. It was a very dry spring, moving around. We watched it come in inlets and kill in an inlet-based pattern. So I started getting a little grumpy about that because I was not happy with how long it took with paperwork and different things going on. So the spikes that you see here are actually the chicken egg-laying sites. You can see the greatly increased time to depopulate these large chicken sites compared to largely turkey sites. So if I stack that same graph, same data, only put it on a timeline, and put the number of days that a site was from sampling to depopulation. So again, to use the same example as last time, this first site that happened, it took 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 days to depopulate. Trying to get an idea of what was the risk of something that could be shedding through the exhaust fans, for example, or people movement, or equipment movement. So if I stack all the different sites, you can see a nice curve there. And nice, not in a good way. But at any one point in time, at the peak here, we had at least 30 farms shedding virus into the environment. Now, that's a problem. And so we really changed that, and that's one improvement. The interesting thing was this is, again, we talk about science and literature, but are we actually looking at it and believing it? This was out of a Dutch outbreak around an H7N7 that they did some modeling then on it, and some key takeaways was that the delay between detection and depopulation drove the outbreak, which is what we'd also say. The average size of the outbreak was 233. We had 211. Immediate depop has the biggest impact. We would agree with that. Once the susceptible farms were away, meaning all the birds were dead in an area, the outbreak died. That makes common sense. And that's kind of what we went through in Minnesota, is once we got pretty much everything dead in the area, that's when it finally quit. And so that's, we'll play into that in a little bit later. And waterfowl were likely the introduction, but probably not the sustaining movement, which we'd also agree with. So we had that to change, and there's been some changes. I'll kind of give you a summary of different things, but we put a lot of work in. The USDA has pledged to get to a 24-hour euthanasia attempt on any outbreaks, which will greatly speed that up. And a lot of the paperwork and different things that we struggled with early on have been improved. The other thing for the industry is we had a concept of biosecurity that was probably flawed. If you used to look, this is one of our lay farms, for example. This red box was our fence line. Okay, so we had where guys came in and ladies came into the shower area. We shower through, and this magic force field of a chain link fence kept all disease at bay. And we just figured once we shower, we can walk to and from the barns, in and out of them. And that's the way the industry across the U.S. really operated, if we're honest with ourselves. And so we had to really change on our end the idea of biosecurity, because whatever this magic force field dome that chain link fence provides wasn't really accurate. We had to change our concept to where the line of separation, which is the term that we're trying to get indoctrinated, is the barn. So death is outside, life is inside. Define the line, defend the line. Different people have come up with different terms for identifying that, but we have a very huge training and education component of redefining where our biosecurity lines are on these farms, because they've been doing it for decades of being able to just shower and walk in and out of barns. And that's going to take some time to correct and recorrect and recorrect and re-educate and recorrect, just like any other behavior in life. And so we've had to do a lot of work on our end of, if this is the line, that means I can't take the tiller from one barn and just drive it over to the other barn either. I have to have some sort of mitigation step. Or do I have multiple tillers? Different things like that. So we've really had to work on the industry end of kind of correcting a lot of, I don't know if I'll say bad behaviors, but incorrect behaviors that have been in there for decades, that we've been able to get by with. You know, like I said, the pictures that you saw in Europe, this goose Guangdong lineage of high path is a new normal. So the thing that we found was the current response plan of the U.S. is this incident command structure, which really came out of firefighting. But it works really well for small outbreaks. And so if this is Minnesota and I have a small little outbreak, it could handle this very well. Very well suited for that. But when we fast forward about 2 weeks and it blows up to this, it gets a little overwhelming with how it was set up. So this is only maybe half the cases in Minnesota. This would be some orange cases from some chicken egg layer cases that were in throughout there. But this really overwhelms incident command structure, how it was structured previously. So we had to make some adjustments. So I'm going to show you something to keep in mind. This outbreak was the largest foreign animal disease outbreak in U.S. history. I'm going to show you this map, This is one of the dense areas, if you will, of Minnesota for turkey production. Our farms tend to be fairly large turkey farms. But if you look, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. You can't quite make it, might have got cut off. 10. There's about 10 farms in this area. This is roughly the same magnification of this. This is very near our operations in the Shenandoah Valley. Like 7 times that number in about the same-ish area. So think in your mind, that's where it hit and it was dense and we had some issues. What if it hits here? And so when we talk about incident command handles this, but it got overwhelmed with this, this is about 8 times the area that I showed you with about the same number of barns. Okay, so we had to make a lot of adjustments. Is my point. We had to figure out how to handle high volume outbreak, because if it hits this area of the valley, my calculations is 30 days. It'll wipe out most of the valley from what we saw. So the really take home is the incident command structure worked. We have no documented cases where any permitted movements resulted in an outbreak. Early on, some of the states were not willing to accept the movement criteria. This draft terminology was one of the things that held it up, and also the way the state was operated, whether it was a Department of Agriculture versus an industry-driven state veterinarian structure. That also changed how they would operate. This is really important for us, obviously, because trying to appease, we tend to ship from Utah to Virginia, trying to appease 20 different state programs that are maybe slightly different than the other becomes very difficult, as well as for international trade. If one state treats it differently than other trading partners around the world, tend to see that as we don't trust our own federal government's response, so why should we trust you to import it in? So that became important. We had to fix that right away, and for the most part that was handled pretty well, and we got that straightened around pretty early on in the outbreak. One of the things that we did, we permitted a lot of the resources for permitting were for low or negligible risk movements, meaning eggs going to the hatchery, eggs going to a breaker, feed coming in, finished meat products leaving a slaughter plant. Things that have very low risk of spreading disease consumed a great amount of permitting capability, and we really lost a lot of the ICS ability by doing that, so we needed to come up with something else. Current methods for doing these are really handy for these small amounts, and so we're working on adjusting a lot of that. So this is one of the ones that I'll pick on because this is our thing, is moving eggs. The way it was set up is I've got eggs collected. They're negative here on test results, and I have these 2 negative test results. Well, moving eggs to a hatchery is pretty low risk, especially with us. We're washing them in 400 parts per million chlorine. We have a lot of mitigation steps, as well as they're going to go in an incubator, which essentially cooks the virus for about 30 days. And so what comes out of there is quite clean, and we needed to adjust some of this and some of the frequency. And so that's just one of the things of the living document or the draft document of the Secure Poultry Supply Plan that we needed to update. So a lot of the improvements, we're working on finishing several different risk assessments. We've been meeting on phone calls, revising a lot of the procedures. Incident command structures evolved quite a bit. We now have an EMERS gateway that many of the states are undergoing some tabletop training and tabletop exercises, where a lot of these low and negligible risk permit movements will be self-guided, meaning I log into a website, I fill in the needed information, they say yay or nay, and it's all electronic versus what we were doing before through emails. The industry is now at the table. There is a spot in the incident command structure for industry. Like I said, the communication was important. Industry and state regulatory people could communicate very well with each other, except they have no way to control it. They're not interfacing on the farms with the birds. And so the people that needed to know weren't in the loop. And so we fixed that in Minnesota pretty quickly. We met 3 times a week. with our response teams. And so now there's actually a box, if you will, in the structure. And to find those key individuals, because you don't want it bogged down with 30 people. That's very ineffective. For the most part, most states have about 5 or less really key, big boy, I'll call them, players that can be on that structure and provide input. And that's where we as veterinarians, and they're usually veterinarians that are on that, we as veterinarians have to take off our industry cap and put on our public health cap, because we did swear to both of those. And so we have to balance that and say, yeah, I really want to do that, but I probably shouldn't. And we did that, and hopefully that's the kind of the level of trust that you have with the group of people. And so we now have a spot at the table, which is helpful, because when they're saying, hey, I need water, the people that are there every day and live there know where you can get water. They know the construction companies that have water tankers that can get you water, for example. Little simple things that should take 5 minutes instead of 5 hours. Industry can help with that. Increased mass depop capabilities. There's been a lot of work on CO2, ventilation shutdown, different procedures there. So that's really coming along, and foaming. We've improved the indemnity, so they've streamlined a lot of the paperwork and different things that we've needed to streamline that really delayed that early on, and you saw that graph that really slowed that up. In Minnesota, this is something that I'd like to roll out to a lot of the states, is an interactive map. One of the things that we struggle with as industry is, we'll pick on Dr. Hickam because she's up front. Dr. Hickam's got her team here, and their response, they draw a circle, say, okay, guys, we're going to go out and do this testing, backyards, who's doing that, who's getting this. Well, then none of us knew for all the unaffected farms whether we needed to test or not. Was I on this side of the line or that side of the line? And we didn't have a very good way, especially as it ramped up when you were having 12 different premises a day pop up, of being able to be in the loop of knowing who had their official regulatory issues there. So we've developed an interactive map. So key folks from each of the different companies sign your life away forms, and we have access to a map that as soon as they put the circle on, we see the circle. We have all the premises lists, ours and other companies. We see them all. We know whose they are. We know the exact addresses. We know the names of them. We're naked in the shower, and we get to see that. The idea is because we're a 24-hour day, 7-day a week. I slept in my office for a while because you just can't keep up. And so commonly results would come out between 7 and 10 o'clock at night. We would text back and forth to the industry, who's got what stuff's going, which stuff's there. By about 3 o'clock, we had that wrapped up. I'd usually get an hour or two on the floor, and we'd start back up in the morning with the trucks going out. And so that was really inefficient. And so now with this interactive map, as soon as they put a circle on, I know who's in it, I know who's out of it, I know everybody around it. It's okay, we all get along. Some of the states struggle and are not able to do that because of different laws within their states. Minnesota has the same thing, that they're not allowed to share that information. Except Minnesota, by dumb luck or strategy, I'm not sure, has wording in their law that says, except in the event of a major animal disease issue, or some sort of wording like that. That could be easily and highly suggestible to put that into your legislatures, get on your different lobbyists, and try to get that inserted in your next legislation, because that's going to be helpful. And from an industry standpoint, this is one of the best things that came out of here, because this ate up my life, is trying to figure this part out. So this interactive map's wonderful, works great. It's based on ArcGIS. Most people are already using that. Very simple thing. So I'm a big-time fan, and I'll come testify in front of your state legislatures if you so choose to get that wording, because it was incredibly helpful. Okay, so my title was really, I'm kind of bouncing around showing you my inner schizophrenia, but what about this idea? For me, like I said, like I started with, when we falter, I've spent time in Paraguay, India, Namibia. When we falter, so does the rest of the world. We're a leader. We have sway. When we don't have corn, when our corn is too short of a crop, they feel it, whether that's economic or in trade or actual corn. When we have excess protein or too short of protein, the rest of the world feels it. And so I think we do have to manage this appropriately, because it's not just the U.S. It's not just my company or Hector's company that's going to feel it. It's other people around the world. So again, why do we have to figure this out? Why should states be active? Why should other organizations, whether that's broilers, dairy, pork? Because this is the map. This is what is over in Europe, and you know, birds move. And if it's in that many wild birds, when is it going to be here? Is it going to hit this dense spot that's even more dense than Minnesota? We have to be ready. For us in the poultry industry, high path AI is kind of a new norm. It's a for real thing, and it's not just a once in 40 years like it was. This is a new normal for us, and we have to be prepared on the poultry side. A lot of people on the cattle or pork side, it's foot and mouth disease is their hot topic. So how do you handle that? Again, the communication part from the start. You know, several of the companies actually had dark websites for influenza information to their constituents or their brand. And so I would encourage pork or anybody else to have that for foot and mouth disease. Start developing that content. So if and when it does, that you're ready to go, and it's not going to be a lot of scrambling and chaos. Because for us in the poultry industry, this is what we're looking at. So these are the different supply plans that I'm aware of. Anywhere from the turkey supply plan has been very well bomb tested and has been tweaked very well and performed very well and has been on a lifesaver. And admittedly, from a personal standpoint, I'm not a big fan of a lot of tabletop exercise, all this junk that goes into these. I'm a boots on the ground redneck, and so I rather go cut up birds or swap stories with the guys rather than sit in a bunch of meetings doing this, but it was an absolute lifesaver. The 10 years that it took to get this in with Dr. Halverson and his team leading it paid off in spades for us. And so you got everywhere from a very well bomb-tested program in turkeys all the way down to where beef supply is kind of in its infancy. So I'd really encourage involvement, industry, regulatory, state, whatever, involvement in developing these, because at least for us, this has been a huge piece for us, even though it doesn't really fit for me. But so this is where I'll wrap it up. Really, you know, we're staring at high path AI around the world. We're almost surrounded. If you look at that globe picture, we've got it on each side of us. We know that it's there. We know that it's most likely coming. We've already seen that already this spring in small numbers in a North American strain. But we don't need to be afraid. We have plans, and hopefully your industries and the different things will also have that, because we don't need to be afraid of it.